Okay, thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Tolpala Radical History School. Nice to see you all turning up for another session. It's always good to know that the first Tuesday of the month we're all going to get together. I think we're expecting about 70 people tonight. So if you could just say hello to everyone when you come in, just let us know that you're there. That would be absolutely fantastic. I see people I know. Nice to see Dick Musket there, and Janet and Chris Mears, and people like that. Very good to see you. Hannah David saying hello to all of us. Thank you very much, Hannah. Just the normal word of warning, if you could be very pleasant and polite to everyone else, that would be absolutely fantastic. The TUC's got a code of conduct, which I'm sure you know by heart by now. And I hope you're going to abide by that. If you've got questions tonight for Madge, could you please put them into the question and answer slot? Hello, Michael from the Forest of Dean. Good to see you there. And Stephen and Joe Cork from UCU. Nice to see the university lecturers represented, the union. So if you've got questions, please put them into the Q&A. That would be absolutely fantastic. And we'll deal with those at the end. Madge is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll be taking questions and answers. So we'll be looking forward to taking your questions at the end. Just waiting a few seconds more. We've got 52 people. We're expecting about 70 people tonight, so we're just going to wait a few seconds more. See who comes in. Hello, Lucy and Dick. I see that there. Greetings from Cardiff. Alan Wilson. Hello from Filton, Stuart and Dawn. Hastings from Maureen and Devon. There we are. Hi, Nigel from Kudsia.
Hi, Kudsia. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Or not see you.
Right. I think we're about ready to begin. I think we've given people a chance to come in. It's my great pleasure tonight to welcome Madge Dresser, who's an expert in the Atlantic slave trade. She's an honorary professor at the Department of Historical Studies in Bristol. She's long been involved in research in the history of the Atlantic slave trade, immigration, ethnic relations, as well as women and the labour movement. She's written extensively for publications both in the UK and abroad. She's given a TED talk on the statue wars in Bristol and Virginia. She's a trustee of both the Bristol Record Society and the Bristol and Gloucestershire Archaeological Society, as well as the Journey to Justice and British Somali Resource Centre. And tonight, she's going to talk to us about Atlantic slavery and its legacy. I've had the great privilege of seeing her slideshow, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. And I'm sure we're going to have lots of very interesting questions at the end. Madge, over to you.
Thank you. So I share my screen now, yes?
Yes, please, yes.
Okay. Right, so just bear with me, everyone. Hi, everyone. Hello. Are we there now? Can you see it all right, Les? Sorry, I can't hear you, Les. Unmute your video. Right. Hello?
Don't forget, Madge, to put your slides up on the main screen. It's showing as a slideshow. Put it on the screen at the bottom.
Okay.
Well done.
Is that right? Okay. Hello, everyone. Just
right.
bear with me. I'm technologically challenged. But thank you very much, well, to Nigel Coster and to Les Kennedy and Tanya Parker for inviting me. And I'm covering quite a wide range of things, and I'm racing through some slides, which you can, I believe you'll be able to refer to later on if you want to. Because a lot of you come with differing, grasp of the Atlantic slavery and the slave trade. So I just want to get some terminology straight first, and then go on to some of the continuing legacies that we have. So I'm going to make a little warning here that some of the historical documents can be offensive and upsetting to us today. So please steel yourself, because I just feel that we have to use the terminology that was used in the day to try to understand them in their historical context, and to ask why these images or these terminologies were used in the way they were, because that can tell us a lot about the period we talked about. But the legacies of Atlantic slavery are huge. and they continue to this day. The economic legacy, architecture, the legacy of underdevelopment in former British slaves colonies, the way that our populations have been, the way that our populations have been projected across the world, the whole idea of racism, the whole idea of the white imaginary, and there's a lot of psychological legacies as well. So let's have a bit of a look. This, of course, is the, I think, very poignant a poster, if you like, taken just after the toppling of the statue, of the Colston statue, and it covers the plinth, which proclaims Colston the virtuous and glorious son of the city, and say this is dedicated to the slaves that were taken from their home, and that seemed to come to the heart, from the heart. So what I want to do is to talk a little bit about basic chronology and terminology. Some of you will know this backwards, some of you won't, but just so we're starting from the same page, and then look a little bit about the continuing legacy of Atlantic slavery, particularly in the Caribbean, the USA. And these are huge legacies, and they really feed into bigger epistemological debates about the critique of the Enlightenment, Eurocentrism, and all sorts of things. So let's just clear up some of the terminology. So one of the things that we have to remember is that Atlantic slavery and the globalized economy really come hand in hand. It's not just about the slave trade. And we're really beginning it from the 1450s to really the end of the 19th and beginnings of the early 20th century to see the globalized economy with all the kind of ecological and human consequences that we see today. So in a way, Atlantic slavery foreshadows the globalized economy that we're talking about today. And so it isn't just about the trade in enslaved people, and we see that there's a whole litany of spin-offs, if you like, from the labor of enslaved Africans, and the Atlantic slavery provided a stimulus for all sorts of things that you wouldn't really associate immediately with the slave trade itself, from the fancy hats and arms and goods and hot well spa water and Bangladeshi calicos that were exported from England, both to the African warlords with whom they traded, but also to the plantation slave regimes in North and Central America and later Latin America, to the processing industries that made the mainland Britain so wealthy. Sorry, I'm just having a meltdown here. There we go, there we go. So there are all sorts of different ways that we can look at the wider Atlantic slave economy. But the slave trade itself, i.e. the trade in enslaved Africans, was a huge thing, but it was the linchpin on which the Atlantic slave economy was grounded. Without the slave labor, you wouldn't have had all the other spin-offs. And so I don't know how many of you knew, but we think with the new databases abounding that at least 10 to 15 million people were transported from Western Africa to the Americas. And that's for most of that time up until the mid 19th century. It's on very small ships. So it's a huge and amazing transfer of population, which changed the world as we know it. And I just want to make sure that you're all clear that there's a difference between the ending of the slave trade versus the ending of enslavement, because we know that in 1807, we have the abolition of the British slave trade, or at least its formal abolition, and the US slave trade as well. You might be surprised to know that the legal ending of slavery wasn't until 1838, and the legal ending of slavery in Brazil and Cuba is in the 1880s. So I think it's important to keep in mind those distinctions between the ending of the slave trade and the ending of enslavement, and just how long it went on for. the relationship between the white laboring poor on the main land Britain and in the colonies and slavery is a complicated one. And some convict and indentured servants and political prisoners were indeed forcibly transported to the slave colonies to work as labor on the plantations. But also you have the phenomenon of impressment as the British Navy, vying for control of the Atlantic, basically impressed or kidnapped people on the British mainland, supposedly as vagrants or as people who should serve aboard the merchant navy and help control the Atlantic Ocean so that Britain could ensure its dominance. And I should just say that Britain, although Spain and Portugal were dominant in the Atlantic slave economy for much of the time from the 1450s, it's really in the 18th century, well, late 17th and 18th century, that Britain becomes a major player and in the end dominates the Atlantic slave economy for the 18th century. And aboard British ships, some 3 million people were transported. So what about the white British working class in Atlantic slavery? It is a complicated relationship. When you get a backlash against representing or talking about Atlantic slavery, people say, well, we were wage slaves too. You know, what about us, and why are we only focusing on enslaved labor or black labor? And that was a trope that was exploited by the pro-slavery forces in the 1820s and 30s, because they espied a central hypocrisy, if you like, between liberalism and the establishment of human rights and anti-slavery, because the pro-slavery advocates would say, well, you know, you are free on the British mainland, but you have the freedom to starve. You're really just wage slaves, and your so-called liberal employers really don't give a damn about you if they don't need you. And so you have here a cartoon that illustrates that. And then they romanticize the position of enslaved people, these pro-slavery lobbies, to say, well, we're being paternalistic. We have to look after our people, even when they're when they're old or they need medical care. Well, that's a gross misrepresentation of the fact, but it does point to this kind of tension between liberalism and the position of the white working class and its attitude towards the British white working class. Now, one of the continuing legacies that we really ought to look at, and to the right you can see a picture by a Bristol-based artist, Rippingill, a very romanticized view of emancipation. And it shows, it was really for the sort of white anti-slavery market, which sort of said, oh, the Africans who have been enslaved, once they're free, they're going to be monogamous and Christian and orderly, and they're going to work hard, etc. And they sold that sort of bill of goods to a rather skittish white audience on the mainland, because in order to reassure people that there wouldn't be huge violence and uproar in the in the colonies once enslaved people were emancipated, that was the bill of goods that they presented to the white audience. But actually, what happens was very different. For a start, after emancipation, people were not really free. The formerly enslaved people. Not only were they not compensated as their quote unquote owners were, but they were really kept through all sorts of discriminatory legislation on the plantations wherever possible. They didn't have the freedom of movement. They didn't have the ability to diversify into different types of ways of earning a living. And so the whole inequality, the political and economic subjugation continues well into the 20th century. So the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and Atlantic slavery does not end with emancipation. And if you look at that picture on the left, that wasn't, I mean, obviously there weren't many photographs of newly enslaved people in the 1830s, but it's interesting that this picture with the white overseer is taken at the turn of the century, and it shows in the early 1900s, and it does show that conditions for the vast majority of Black working class people, if you like, with laboring poor in the Caribbean wasn't all that much different than it was under slavery in terms of the work opportunities. And because of this, you have the Caribbean after the ending of the apprentice system in 1838, a continuation of inequality, and also access to land. And so you had a number of really important rebellions, which were savagely suppressed, and which I'll talk about in a little while, which divide public opinion. And we have to realize or ask ourselves, who is the public that we're talking about? We also have other kind of legacies from this whole colonial era, including the phenomenon of colorism, which is still rife today and informs power structures in Brazil and the Caribbean to this very day. And that is the idea that the darker you are, the less likely you are going to be in the elite and have access to power, because after emancipation, there was an intermediate class of people of mixed heritage who had, sometimes they were slave owners themselves, who were the kind of middle person who were exploited as in a sort of divide and rule way. And that kind of legacy does follow on into the 20th century. So I'm just going to try to move my screen so I can, yes. So one of the phenomena, we've always had racism in the sense of that people don't like other people who aren't like them. But as a developed ideology, it really does develop in the 18th century and certainly consolidates in the 19th. And I was quite surprised when I first started my researches in this area to realize that in early days, there wasn't a really fixed idea about what race you belonged to. Your status was determined as much by your religion or your lineage or the amount of money you had than as your color. But this begins to change. And Thomas Carlyle, and here I apologize for the N word being cited, but he wrote a very influential essay, which says that really Black people after emancipation, people of African origin, are not really fit to rule. They are of a lesser, they're lower down in the totem pole of human evolution, if you like, and that they were born to be servants. So the idea that a developed ideology of racism evolves to justify the subordinate status of Black people. It really takes shape in Britain and in Europe as a whole, and certainly in America. And I should just also say that that helps to reconcile this contradiction between the English seeing themselves as or the English ruling classes seeing themselves as a harbinger of democracy and liberalism, and we shall never, never, never shall be slaves, and the actual repressive way they treated people in the colonies. So colonialism rather than self-rule obtained in Jamaica and elsewhere until the 1960s. The Morant Bay Rebellion, both Black and brown people rose up in order to get access to land and political power, which was savagely repressed, was seen as a failure of emancipation policy and as evidence of Afro-Caribbeans' incapacity for self-government. And so there was the idea that the colonialists really had to look after and rule for the people over whom they had control. Oops, sorry. And it's in this atmosphere of racism, of denigrating Black people as lower down the great chain of being, if you like, in which we have to understand people like Marvin Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And Garvey was of Jamaican origin, and he is an enormously influential, even today, enormously influential force, because he kind of turned white racism on its head and emphasized racial separation, economic self-determination for Black people, and Black superiority. And so it's kind of a mirror vision. It's an ideology that is evolved in the face and in reaction to white supremacy and the growing ideology of white racism. And one of the things that Garvey did was he's very proud of the African origins. It wasn't, he really said that this was should be a source of pride, which really struck a chord, particularly with the dispossessed agricultural workers and their descendants in the colonies. Now, by the, as bad as things were up until the 1880s for Black people, particularly after the sugar prices were suffering from European competition, beetroot sugar, et cetera. You have a tremendous depression, underinvestment in the Caribbean. And then the world depression means that with tariffs and trade barriers, means that the prices for agricultural produce, such as the Caribbean could export, fell through the floor. And so a lot of people were virtually starving in the Caribbean during this period. And the answer of the authorities was to repress them. There were a lot more jails and a lot more repressive activities, and trade unions were banned in this period. But there was just a massive outpouring of uprisings throughout the Caribbean during this period. Widespread labor rebellion in the late 1930s. And labor unions had been outlawed until the late 1930s. And it's in that atmosphere that you have the rise of Rastafarianism. And Garvey influenced the Rastafarians, who believed in Black superiority and repatriation to Africa. And it's no accident that the first branch of Rastafarianism was established in the 1930s. And Howell, Leonard P. Howell, who was probably the first sort of Rastafarian, he preached the divinity of Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, partly because Haile Selassie was seen as someone who had never bent his neck to colonialism. And he explained that, Blacks would gain superiority over whites that had always been intended for them. So that is one of the sort of mantras. But we have, there are many branches of Rastafarianism, but that was, I think it's important to realize that it grew up in this economically distressed time. And labor unrest was so bad in the 1930s that a royal commission was put in place, the Monet Commission, to investigate the reasons for this. And Moyne was a liberal, a progressive in many respects. And when he investigated the living conditions and the real buying power of Black people in the 1930s in the Caribbean, he realized that not only was their buying power the same in real buying power terms as the newly emancipated ancestors of those people who had been in 1838. In other words, things haven't really changed in terms of their buying power. But not only that, but such was the lack of investment in infrastructure in the Caribbean that many of those people in the 1930s were still living in slave shacks and really suffering the same kind of infrastructural deficiencies as obtained in the Caribbean islands during the times of slavery. And the findings were so explosive that it was not reported until after the war, because they realized that they didn't want to have to deal with labor unrest in the Caribbean when they were trying to gear up to fight the Germans. And it's quite shocking, really, to think that full adult suffrage was finally awarded in the British Caribbean in the 40s. And you begin to get the independence for various colonies during the 1960s. And you do see with independence a brief boom as demand for bananas and bauxite and tourism flourishes. But neocolonialism continues, and continuing underdevelopment under neocolonial policies also disadvantages a proper and uncorrupt kind of regimes in many of the colonies. And of course, that meant with the lack of opportunities in the British Caribbean, when there was a labor shortage after the war on mainland Britain, and the NHS needed staffing, and a lot of the foundry jobs and the sort of so-called dirty jobs were no longer as attractive to white working class. You get, the Windrush generation coming over and the immigration to mainland Britain, and the kind of populist backlash that we get, if we see on the left. The right is, of course, a poster from Bristol of the Windrush, one of the, by Michelle Curtis, that is on one of the houses in St. Paul's in Bristol. So one of the lasting legacies is the coming back of Black people across the Atlantic, but this time to the British Empire, in quite small numbers actually, but enough to excite a kind of hysteria about economic competition, undermining white employment opportunities. But it isn't just economic. And I think a lot of people who are on the left like to see things in strictly economic terms, but there was this subtext of cultural fear based on the long legacy of people being scared about the rebelliousness and violence of enslaved people in the colonies, and this sexual fear, actually, that Black men are going to wreak their vengeance on white women. So we have a number of continuing legacies, in Virginia, the legacy still obtains. The USA is independent of Britain since 1784, but Glasgow grew prosperous on the tobacco trade, and links with the tobacco industry persisted in Britain throughout the 18th and 19th century, especially even after 1865, with the use by British firms of processing slave-produced tobacco, and even after that, processing and growing wealthy on the processing of slave-produced tobacco by indebted, debt-bonded sharecroppers. And so I'm just sort of saying that there has been new reevaluation of the dependence of Scotland, which was seen as a harbinger of enlightenment and anti-slavery, et cetera. But actually, although that's true, there was a lot of wealth that poured in both during the 18th century, tobacco trading and which was dependent on slave trading, and also with tobacco processing. And many of the legacies that have been left to Edinburgh and Glasgow University, et cetera, we now realize are people who after emancipation, brought a lot of the money that they got from plantation wealth and compensation monies and invested it into cultural institutions such as universities on the mainland. And on the right, we have a picture of Will's factory, one of the Will's factories in Bristol, which was a huge source of employment for paternalistic employment for both women and men in the tobacco industry. So the white working class did benefit from the proceeds of enslaved labor in direct ways. Another legacy. How am I doing for time there, Les?
10 minutes.
Okay, fine. Another legacy is that people who were well, I'll tell you a little story. The Gist settlement in Bristol, there is a posh private school, Queen Elizabeth Hospital, but it used to be take in charity boys and then give them employment opportunities as indentured labor in Virginia. And one such person was Samuel Gist. He was a bright guy. He became a charity a pupil, and then was indentured over to work on the tobacco plantation of a master in Virginia. He was so smart and so canny that he not only impressed his master, but when his master died, he married his widow and inherited, under the laws of the day, the tobacco plantations and the enslaved people thereon. And he also became a very wealthy tobacco trader. And after the War of Independence, he was a British loyalist. He actually gave a will, stipulating in his will of 1808, that the slaves on his plantation should be freed. But you couldn't be a free Black person in Virginia in those days. And so they were transported to Indian country, if you like, which was the term of the time, wild settlements in Ohio along the river that was immortalized in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And they had small holdings, and they were given small holdings. And pictured here are the descendants of those very people who lived in very straitened circumstances in the middle of what is now Trump country. And they decided to commemorate the small holdings. And many of them, until very, very recently, were living on those same small holdings. But these small holdings are now being, because they're seen as valuable land, a lot of them are being resettled and bought out by forces who are trying to force these people off their land. And there's all sorts of difficulties. And many of those people, they've been some of them are socially mobile, but many of them remained, economically disadvantaged and politically disadvantaged. And the Gist settlement people whom I met on the internet and, exchanged emails with, a lot of them still suffer from racist abuse, and their markers and their have been vandalized to this day. One of the important legacies of slavery is the representation of the way Black people are associated with slavery. And this was a picture by the late lamented Tony Forbes, who was commissioned to do this for the slavery for the Bristol City Museum when it gave its first slavery exhibition. And it shows Colston with skulls at the Colston statue with skulls at the bottom, chaining, as it were, Tony Forbes himself, who is of Jamaican origin, but was brought up in a white working class estate in Southmead in Bristol. And the Matthew is in the foreground, and it's alluding to the way that Black people are misrepresented. But it's also alluding to the sus laws. You notice that Tony is encased in police tape, and many young people in the 1980s, many young Black people were harassed by the police under the Vagrancy Acts, which were first introduced in the 1820s to control white labor, the unemployed people who are coming in after the Napoleonic Wars and looking for work. And so there is a connection between anti-vagrancy legislation affecting white working class people and the sus laws of the 1980s. And also, if you look at the Caribbean, it was also very much analogous to the kind of laws limiting mobility for the newly emancipated slaves. So we need to see these things in global context. And the other interesting thing in the background is showing the Clifton Suspension Bridge and the people in Clifton, the elite, dancing to sound systems and Black music, but not really caring about the disadvantage and representation of that Tony Forbes suffered at the time. We have to read each of these portraits in a different way according to the times now, because it could be seen that we really shouldn't look, some people have argued we really shouldn't even look at this representation because it casts Tony as a victim rather than as a resistor. Another interesting aspect of white working class relationship to enslavement, et cetera, was during the American Civil War, where there was a blockade instituted. So the importation of the slave-produced cotton, which fueled the factory employment of so many working class people in Lancashire, et cetera, caused huge privation. And so many workers in Lancashire favored the Confederate cause because their jobs were dependent on cotton, but many others embraced the anti-slavery cause despite the economic disadvantage it brought them and the hardship that they suffered. But we have to distinguish between anti-slavery laws and anti-racism, anti-slavery sentiment, anti-racism. People could be against slavery, but still hold denigrating or racist views about Black people who were enslaved. And I think that's is much true of the working class as middle class people at that time. That circle of empathy that Frank O'Gorman talks about, the idea that you could really identify your own circumstances and identify as a human being with people of color, is something that begins with anti-slavery, et cetera, but it really doesn't take a fuller effect until well into the 20th century. And one of the other enduring legacies is that when a lot of the investment from the Industrial Revolution and which derived in part from the compensation slave owners reinvest in the British mainland, you begin to get with industrialization the schooling of the working classes by the 1870s and 80s. But it wasn't schooling to rule the world like they were in Eton. It was schooling to be good factory fodder. And one of the ways that you could divide and rule, if you like, is to make even working class people feel that they may be poor, but they were part of a great and glorious British Empire. And they were better than, and I use the term because I've heard this in an oral interview, better than the darkies. So you have people here, young kids blacking up, and as Asians, as indigenous people, as people in the Caribbean and elsewhere, as part of the great British Empire. And I think that that kind of racist education and imperialist education, which gave people a source of pride and a way to identify with the nation and not looking at the class divisions that divided it, is a legacy which may inform white working class attitudes, or some white working class attitudes, to this very day. And so we see with the Bristol bus boycott, with which I presume you're familiar, or you could ask me about it, that you have this idea that some white working class members of trade unions voted against having Black drivers and Black conductors on the buses, and that they felt any kind of, and that the regional leadership turned a blind eye to this for all their vouting of international socialism and that we're all brothers. So there's a kind of lack of fit between trade union policy at times and the anti-racist attitudes that they were, socialists were supposed to be vaunting. And the psychological legacy, if you don't know where you come from, or if you only know about your enslaved past with all the kind of awfulness and trauma and rape and survival and accommodations people had to make just to survive, as well as the resistance. I mean, there's a huge emphasis on resistance now. It's very traumatic not to know where you come from. And Adrian Stone, who's from St. Paul's, has done fantastic pioneering work. He's by beginning to investigate his background in a very forensic and a disciplined way. And he found not only did he have ancestors and forebears who were Chinese and white and Scottish and from all over the Caribbean, but he was able to show, he was able to trace back to the first African ancestor that came over from Africa in the 1780s, probably from possibly Calabar. But that's a whole other story. But there's a huge gap in many young people of color. You know, where do they come from? What's their identity? And why was it truncated in the during the slave trade? And why do we only look at Black identity through slavery? Because one of the most insidious legacies of Atlantic slavery is that where slavery was pandemic, if you like, in the ancient early modern world, it's in the 18th century that it becomes, slave status becomes increasingly identified with people of African origin. So there are untold stories that need to be told. We need to look at our own views about white working class relationship to enslavement. To what extent do white working class people benefit from white privilege? To what extent can we make analogies between the exploitation of white working class people and the exploitation of people of color? I'll leave these to you to think about and discuss. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Madge. Would you like to stop sharing your screen now? Would that be all right?
Well, yes.
And we'll go back to a bigger view.
Right.
Oh, there we are. Good to see you. Kevin Dykes has put a couple of questions in. Thank you very much. That was really, really very interesting talk. Very good. Kevin would like to know what happened to the 300,000 slaves who were brought to Europe.
Well, it varied, and I'm not quite sure where he got that number, but people came in different guises. So in the early days, well, Miranda Kaufman has talked about there were black people in Tudor England, and there were probably, but they were very far and few between, I have to say. And not all of them have enslaved status, but it obtained from relationships that Britain had with the Spanish and Portuguese Empire, et cetera. And then when Britain really got involved in enslavement, slave ship captains were given what was called a privileged Negro. And if they had a successful voyage and they got, they made a profit, et cetera, they would get the equivalent of price of one or two or more Black people, if you like, whom they could sell on in the Caribbean, or they could bring back to sell on as servants to the ennobled households, the aristocratic households, where it was a status symbol to have a young Black boy as a livery servant. But other people came as seamen. A few came. There were a few people of children of West African warlords who were cultivated by the British in a very cynical way because they wanted these warlords to buy from them and not from the French. And so you had an array of different people. But the problem with being of enslaved status, particularly in England, was that your status was uncertain, because on the one hand you were the property of an Englishman, and one of the sort of things was an Englishman's home is his castle, and we weren't like Russia or France, where an autocrat could just take your property away. So you had to respect the property rights of people. At the same time, you have this common law tradition of seeing people, particularly if they've been baptized as Christians, as human beings. So you have a messy legal situation there, and often people who found their way into Britain as of Black or partially Black origins, found that their status was often contested. And if you couldn't read or write, or you didn't have powerful friends, it was very easy to get re-enslaved and shipped back to the Caribbean. And there were court cases, taken on this, which we could discuss. So, okay. And I should just say a few people did marry into the, if they were of mixed race, they were incorporated into the ruling classes, the mistresses of and their children of slave owners.
Yeah. Somebody who hasn't given us their name, did all slaves come through Bristol? As I thought Liverpool was a major port at the time.
Well, the thing about Bristol is that it was Liverpool came late in the day in the 1750s. It really overtook Bristol. I mean, London and Bristol were the main slaving ports, if you like, in the early 18th century, and then Liverpool, for all sorts of different reasons, gained an ascendancy, and it had bigger ships and a more entrepreneurial view. So Liverpool overtakes Bristol, but Bristol was the #1 slave trader for a brief period in the 1730s. But London, which keeps very stum about it until recently, was extremely important.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Stephanie Mathivet, who had difficulty getting video, asks, in addition to the manufactured goods going across the Atlantic, there was also the benefit to Britain in the trade supplying plantations on the packet ships bringing the sugar, etc. How valuable was this trade to the British economy, e.g. wood, planks, nails, beams, horse beams, etc.?
Huge. And for example, one of the things that surprised me was that hats, the hat making industry, which is an artisan industry, mad as a hatter, that kind of thing in the white working class. Yeah. A lot of that, the exports for hats was to the slave plantations, not just for the planters, but for enslaved people to wear. And to trade with the West African warlords, fancy hats as bling, as prestige goods. So you have all sorts of spin-offs and unexpected things. The herring industry. Who would have thought the herring industry had much to do with slavery? But of course, it was John Cabot who opened up herring, as it were, to colonial exploitation. But hackey and sawfish is dried herring that was exported as slave food. And so you have all sorts of different spin-offs that you just wouldn't expect. And all of them were, fed into the wealth.
Would you like to say a bit more about the background of Marcus Garvey, which led him to come to his mirror view of society?
Oh, right. Well, for someone who, I hosted an exhibition years ago about Garvey, and it should all be at my fingertips, but I'm getting old and my memory is not what it could be under pressure. But Garvey was, well, first of all, he was an entrepreneur. He had the steamship line a Black Star line. He wanted to, he wanted to have a economic opportunity for Black people to be economically dependent. But he also was ideologically just rejecting the idea that Black people were, inferior. So I'm not quite sure where that came from, but it proved to be an inspiration. It proved that kind of, I suppose, it's just standing things on the head. In a way, he imported many of the concepts that were used in white supremacy and just flipped them.
Did he come from a relatively wealthy background then?
Not hugely. I mean, he wasn't. I think he was from a sort of middling background, but I'd have to check my facts on that. I don't want to.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
Would you like to say a bit more about the Morant Rebellion and the effect that had? You seem to skim over that.
Oh yeah, well, it's really complicated, and but basically, you had a man of color who was a plantation owner himself, and I'm struggling for his name now, who led a rebellion because there had been many people were subject to land grabs and terrible treatment by the local militia in Jamaica, which was still dominated by white planters, et cetera. And some of the this brown middling class, supported the plight of the rank and file Africans. And what happened was there was a rebellion. It escalated into violence, and white plantation owners were attacked. And it was savagely suppressed by a man named Governor Eyre, who was the governor at the time, in the sense that not only what were the enslaved or the formerly enslaved rebels shot down and killed without trial and hunted down, but also the colored classes who supported them were executed without due process. And so it was just savagely suppressed. And so it really split British opinion on the mainland. And people like John Stuart Mill, these liberals, were saying that that Governor Eyre, should be pilloried for this and prosecuted, where people like Charles Dickens took the other side and was saying, the white working class is, badly treated. Why don't we talk more about them? And, these people are savage and they shouldn't be emancipated, and we must suppress them. So we had a real division within the mainland about this.
Okay. Rosemary Caldecott would like to know if the crews on slavish ships settled or jumped ship. In that context, were they badly treated?
They were awfully treated. That doesn't mean they weren't complicit in sexually exploiting or being violent towards the people that they enslaved, but they had a really awful time because the captain was the virtual master. He was the absolute ruler of his ship, and he often punished the sailors horribly and killed people. And we have accounts of the awful treatment of anybody who was seen as bucking the authority or questioning or somehow displeasing the captain, some of whom were absolute sadists and psychopaths, it seems to me, because he had absolute power. Even if you were a nice captain or you tried to be, you had to be violently suppressive of both your crew and the enslaved Africans, because you didn't want a rebellion on your hand. You didn't want a mutiny either. So white sailors were really badly treated. They died from diseases. They were often dumped on the colonies with no way of getting back. So, they were victims too, but not, at least they had human status under the law in a way that the enslaved Africans didn't. And the amount, there was a lot of resistance of all sorts amongst Africans, but the amount of sexual violence meted out, and physical violence, and the disemvoweling of people, and just terrible things that were happening to anyone who rebelled was just horrendous.
I'm going to try and put two questions together in one, because it might well take us to the end of the program. The first one was from Danny, who starts off with: the abolition of the slave trade and slavery continue to be confused in British education. The fact that unfree and unforced labour in the empire continued for decades after 1838 is rarely talked about. What should the labour movement do about this? And before we go to that, Stephanie Matherett, whose question we just answered, has come back and said, would you agree that teaching Black history helps to prise this particular can of worms open? So if you'd like to talk about education in Britain, we'll go from there.
Well, I think we all deserve a better education, and certainly the curriculum needs reforming. Whether you simply teach it through the lens of Black history, well, that's a first step. It's hard to be inclusive and have a non-elitist and globalized view of history without, how much can you cover, but you need to start where people are at. If you only teach Black history, it can have certain dangers where you're overinflating the role of race in determining people's life chances, although it is a major determinant. And also, do you only want to talk about Black history in terms of slavery? That's really depressing for particularly Black kids, who often will turn to embrace quite racially essentialist, Black superiority kind of ideologies in, ancient Egypt and all that in recompense. If you try to incorporate, white working class history, that's really important too. But it's really difficult to know how to load the curriculum in a way which starts from where the pupils are at and looks at all the evidence. But I think it can be done through debate and listening to each other and having a respectful and open and empirically verifiable way of looking at history, and not just go to Wikipedia or even worse, some of the Facebook and WhatsApp pages that kids access their history on.
It has to be a more all-encompassing view of education, doesn't it? Really, that's what I believe, anyway. Haiti's come up, and Haiti was very much a slave island, wasn't it? What was the impact of the Haitian Revolution within the empire? I suppose that's Toussaint we're talking about there, Ollie. I think so.
Yes, it's huge, and of course, people people want to emphasize the resistance of enslaved Africans and the success of this, the guerrilla warfare and the genius of Toussaint Louverture, and then the legacy after that was much more problematic because you had repression within Haiti as well. But it was Haiti's a really interesting and very important point, because I think it really did convince colonial powers that maybe they couldn't suppress. The writing was on the wall for slave regimes, you begin to get movement, about slavery when that happened. But the legacy of Haiti is a very vexed one, because it did lead to pretty repressive governments afterwards, partly because of the oppression that colonialist powers exerted on Haiti as well.
Yes, I think that it's a very interesting point you've made there. Thank you for that. And I think we're coming now to the end, Madge. It falls upon me to thank you. There is one other question which Nigel Costa is answering, because it's a question about what can the TUC do to support projects on the African diaspora, and I think Nigel's answering that as I'm speaking to you now. There was another question it wasn't a question, it was a point about Drax, who owns a huge amount of Dorset, who's been in the news recently, and people just drawing attention to him. And people are now beginning to say thank you to you, and I must thank you. I think you've tremendously interesting talk. You've opened my eyes. I'm sure you've opened the eyes of many people in the audience as well. And we thank you for your time and effort and the excellent presentation you've given us tonight. And I'm hoping we can work together again in the future. I'd like to bring Nigel in now, if Nigel could turn his camera back on, if you're there, Nigel. Because I know we've got to have a quick advert for the next session. The next session will be on Tuesday, the 9th of March. Hello, Nigel. The next session will be...
Thank you very much, Madge. I thought that was a brilliant contribution in ours, so thank you very much. And yes, onward to the next one. Let me share my screen if I can, and just a quick advert for Professor Claire Griffiths, who'll be speaking about the 6 men of Dorset, the Tolpuddle Martyrs, and the making of a legacy. Claire's done a lot of research about the way that we've remembered the Tolpuddle Martyrs, so be delighted to have her. She's been a visitor to the Radical History School.
She has.
Tolpuddle itself. And then in April, date for your diary, God's Beautiful Sunshine, which is a description of being out of the mines. And it's a title of a new book by Ian Wright, who's written about the miners' lockout, particularly in the Forest of Dean in 1921. So 100th year anniversary of the lockout, and he has done a lot of work into it. So I'd be really pleased to hear Ian.
Thank you for that, Nigel. And here we are. 2 minutes to go before the end of the program. Thank you again, Madge. It's been great to have you. I hope you've looked at the chat and you've seen what people are saying. Brilliant. I'll email you with my local investigations. Thanks, Madge. Very informative talk from Danny in Plymouth. Thank you for putting together. This is the first time I've been to one of these. I've stumbled across your meeting. So there you are, Madge. That's very...
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, and but you can do your own local research and really contribute to more inclusive histories. And
yeah, it's been an absolutely brilliant evening. Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed it. And I know, looking at the comments in the chat, thank you, Dave, for that little bit of information about Garvey as well. Started out as a printer, trade unionist in Kingston, took part in an unsuccessful strike in 1912, way before the Black Star Line. So thank you for that, Dave. Always lovely. Well, thank you very much. It's time for us to draw this to a close tonight. I hope to see you again in March when we look at the Toll Puddle Martyrs and how the TUC managed to choose those as people to celebrate trade unionism. Thank you for your time, Madge. Thank you for all the effort you put into this, and to you, Nigel, as well. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Good night, everyone.